Welcome to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Scott Parker, Design Director at Studio 111 in Long Beach, California. Scott is a licensed architect with over 20 years of experience in architectural design. As Project Design Director at Studio 111, his work encompasses various project types, including hospitality and mixed-use developments. Scott's approach emphasizes creating meaningful places while ensuring value for project stakeholders. He also brings his teaching experience into his role of design director, fostering a collaborative design studio atmosphere within his teams. In addition to his professional work, Scott has taught at several major Los Angeles area universities, including SciArc, Otis College of Art and Design, Art Center, Cal Poly Pomona, and USC, contributing to architectural education in the region. The project we will be talking about today is the West Harbor Project at the Port of Los Angeles. The West Harbor Project breathes new life into the former Portsa Call, a once cherished LA landmark that had fallen into disrepair. Studio 111 reimagined the space with a bold new vision, a collection of large, flexible, pre-engineered metal shed buildings that line a new 1-mile-long waterfront promenade. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Scott Parker, Design Director at Studio 111 in Long Beach, California. The project we're going to talk about today is the West Harbor Project at the Port of Los Angeles. Scott, welcome to Detailed. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about this great project.
I am as well. I have to tell you that I went through a whole craft beer phase for a really long time until I realized just how many calories were in beer. And one of my favorite breweries I've ever visited was in Long Beach.
Oh.
Yeah. It's like I've told myself if I ever go back there, I'm still going to go have another beer there.
Well, that's amazing.
I wrote down the name of it. I had to look it back up. Beechwood Blendery.
Oh, yeah. No, Beechwood's right down the street from our office. We're in downtown Long Beach, and they're right there on the promenade.
They make a good beer.
They do make a good beer. I am not a beer drinker. I'm more of a, as you can tell by the environment, of a rum drinker. But a lot of people in the office, they love to go down and get a growler and have a good time after work.
I'm a whiskey girl these days, but if I came back to Long Beach, I would stop in there.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit. We always start with a fun icebreaker question. I just make it up as I go.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fun to learn a little bit about our guests outside of architecture. So reading your bio, it sounds like you have a pretty demanding job. And in addition, you teach outside of your day job. What do you do to disconnect and have fun? How do you de-stress?
Well, ironically, the teaching is part of that. But yeah, I mean, outside of sort of architecture itself, I'm a pattern of obsessions throughout my life, whether it was Woody Allen, John Cage, whatever it might be. At the moment, you're sort of seeing it all around me, which is why I wanted to do the podcast here. So I'm in a home tiki bar that my son and I built, and that's what we've been obsessing over for the last few years. Also behind me, which you may or may not be able to see, are all the other obsessions. So whether it's my sci-fi reading in Dune or my fantasy reading on Lord of the Rings, which is behind my other shoulder, that's sort of what I do to relax when I'm not spending time with my family.
Well, a good obsession outside of work is never a bad thing.
Sure.
Provided it's not a bad thing. It's not
hurting
you
at all.
Always
go to excess. I could be like my grandfather, which I try not to be. So
I can relate to that. We won't go into that story. So let's talk about this project. Wow. When I first got the information, I thought, wonder what this is. And started doing some reading, and I'm like, Wow. This is something else. This is not just a building. This is
In
a whole development. So give me a little background on this project and this site. What
Sure.
did you start out with and what was the owners looking to turn it into?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating site. It has a great history. It started off as ports of call way back when, so built in 1963, and it was sort of an early effort of how do we bring people to the water and make the water accessible. I mean, it's a wonderful tradition in California with, you know, the sort of access to the waterfront as a right rather than as a privilege. And this is part of it, is sort of an extension of that. So you have ports of call starting in 1963. Also on the site, you have the San Pedro Fish Market, which is still there. We keep sort of helping them move around the site to stay intact. But they're an amazing local hero in the area that we wanted to maintain. So Ports of Call stays around as long as it could, and maybe a little bit past when it should have. My only connection to Ports of Call is my grandparents loved it. So whenever they had a chance to do a special occasion, get away, get out, they went to Ports of Call all the way from Monrovia. So hour drive, no problem. We're going to the best place in all of Southern California. And then it starts to slow down into the early aughts. And in 2018, the port tears it down. So suddenly there's this hole, and they had already started the process and selected our clients, the Radkovich Company and the Jericho team, as to take over the site. So what their vision is to create a true retail destination, but a more modern one, something not as themed. So the one that we're replacing, Ports of Call, was a New England whaling village. So it should look ye olde. It should have brick cobblestones and things of that nature. It was kind of cute, sort of almost like an early version of responding to Disneyland. In fact, the owner had some amazing tiki bars, as it turns out, in addition to the Ports of Call village. So cute, but those things tire over time. And the goal here is to create something that is a little more honest and a little more of San Pedro. So rather than trying to import something from the East Coast, why don't we look at the actual area around us and what makes the site so beautiful and unique? And we'll talk about that in some of the other parts of our conversation, but it's not a whaling village. It's not a fishing village. It's a working port. And that should be the basis of whatever happens on the site.
So then tell me a little bit about your design vision and goals for this project once you got an initial directive from the owners.
Absolutely. So to credit where credit's due, the client really had this goal of, we should have this honest approach. So rather than sort of looking at a lot of the different developments you see in Los Angeles along the waterfront, where it's like a pleasure harbor. It has some of those elements, but it's primarily not that. It's fishing, it's shipping, it's the major port on the West Coast. And so the key here for the design was to key into that. So looking at, when you go down there, there's these huge shipping cranes, gigantic boats come in. I mean, when the boats come in from into the harbor, they're stacked 9 stories tall of shipping containers bringing goods in from all over the world. So there's this huge scale, and it's strongly industrial in character. And that's completely unique in terms of other waterfront developments, whether you think of the one down in Newport Beach, the Lido Village. Lido Village is a beautiful little development, retail development, but it's very much about sailboats and $1 million yachts and things of that nature. This is exactly the opposite of that. We're surrounded by people offloading fish and things of that nature. There's people doing actual work there. Like I said, deliveries coming in. You do get the cruise ship every now and then, but really what you're going to see is a sort of the theater of all, economic engine of the West Coast, all these pieces coming in from all over the world. And that's actually really extraordinary, what we wanted to celebrate. And I think, like I said earlier, credit where credit's due, that was the vision of the client as well. So rather than trying to make this sort of super clean, something a little maybe corporate and slick, like you see at a lot of developments. It was embracing this sort of much more working class area. San Pedro is a small but proud community, and they didn't want something that was a duplication of something you might see in Seattle or San Francisco or Boston. They wanted something that truly grew out of San Pedro, and hopefully that's what we're providing.
Well, I think it looks pretty amazing. With so many things going on with this project, I'm really curious. I mean, and we'll get into that in a minute in the phases. But
Yeah.
what did the planning and programming phase look like? Like, how did you efficiently work through all of these details? That this is a huge site with the owner and the project team.
Yeah, well, that's really been interesting. It's a daily meeting, or weekly meeting that we have. They had a really strong overall notion when we came onto the project while they were working with the harbor to get awarded the site. And, they wanted a retail destination that was much larger than San Pedro. We want to bring people in from LA. We want people to come in from Orange County. And so this idea of a larger scaled retail and dining with some entertainment and some other pieces so that there's a reason to come back. So when we came on, that was already sort of envisioned and imagined. So while that was happening, part of this, our master planning effort with ourselves, with field operations, and some of the other team members, was to break this incredibly large site into smaller pieces that could be sort of programmed in different ways, which we can talk about a little bit. So we looked at all these different sort of outdoor spaces in the beginning, sort of how to program some of those. So there's North Park, Central Park, what's South Park, which is where the amphitheater will be eventually, is bringing those and making those all unique and different. So part of that effort was something that we did in-house. We brought in all the team members. It's an incredibly large team on the client side. So you have Jericho, you have Ratkovich. On each of those teams, there's leasing teams, there's branding people, there's just a lot of different voices. And it's a really interesting group. And what's really fascinating is they don't all necessarily see the project exactly the same way. So part of what we did with this placemaking effort, which was an all-day charrette in our office, where it's like, I don't know, 50 people at least. It was a really interesting, robust discussion about what should this be? What is this supposed to mean? What should this look and feel like? And it could have gotten really contentious, and it wasn't. It was actually really incredibly collegial, and everyone wants the best for the project. They just wanted the chance to like, hey, I think this thing should be painted red, and someone else to go, no, it should really be green. And then we talked it through, and then suddenly the people on the red camp or the people on the green camp found commonality, and we ended up somewhere in the middle, but not in a compromise kind of way, more in a, oh, that's what you meant when you said red. That changes how I see what I said when I meant green. When I said green, what I really meant was this. And then we discovered that there was a lot more commonality, even though the way people were expressing their ideas or their thoughts or the reference imagery they were using for the project was completely different than what they actually meant. So suddenly you discovered like, no, actually the Central Park wants to be this incredibly green space as opposed to this heavily programmed space, which a lot of people were saying it needs to be this, it needs to be this, and using all these reference imagery, this reference projects that were maybe not the most appropriate for what we were trying to do here and what was unique about the harbor. But once you sort of work through those ideas and thoughts and came back to it, you discovered, actually, I think what you mean is this. And then suddenly at the end of it, everyone felt 100% better about the project. So those kinds of programming efforts have happened on multiple occasions. The placemaking sort of charrette was the big one where we got all 50 people together, but there's been lots of smaller ones. So for example, we have a mile-long waterfront. It's, once again, incredibly unique resource in all of Los Angeles to get that much area under the control of one ownership group. How do you make that interesting, right? There's a danger that, a lot of waterfronts, like you get on a boardwalk, and I'm not going to pick on any particular boardwalk, but you get on a boardwalk and it's kind of boring. you walk them and you're like, I've seen it. It's the water on one side, on my right or my left, and there's some stuff on the other side. And I'm going to go right back and see the whole mile again. And so we went through a series of programming efforts about that as well, so that there's always something new happening. So that when you start in a park, you go past some buildings. On the water side, there's different waterside attractions, whether you're renting a boat, you're getting on, a spa is envisioned. Like maybe there's a spa and something. There's an oyster bar on a boat. There's overwater decks of different scales, sizes, and material with different kinds of tenants. So what you hopefully don't end up with is just restaurant, bar, restaurant, bar, restaurant, bar, restaurant, bar for a mile. And we've worked really hard with the owner and the leasing team to create that sort of programmatic diversity. And we've worked with our design team, all the different players, to make sure there's material and furniture, color, look and feel diversity, so that if you do take in the entire mile and walk back, you're going to notice something different every time. And if you come to one part of the project, remember, you don't necessarily come and walk the whole mile. You might come for dinner. Well, you come for dinner and you realize, oh, we could go on a whaling expedition. Oh, there's a sailboat that has this amazing thing. We should come back and see what's happening over at the amphitheater. You discover there's all these other things that are different time of day events and different programmatic events that you suddenly like, we have to come back and see a concert. Oh, by the way, when we see the concert, there's a brewery right next door that we didn't have because we went to the Mexican restaurant. Let's come back and do the brewery next time and then see a show. And then when you're at the show, one of the tenants, like I mentioned, this potential spa tenant, you'll see the spa tenant. Hopefully they happen, knock on wood. You would see that from the amphitheater. It's like, I have to come back and spend a day there. That's really unique as well. And you can think of a lot of waterfront locations where it's really just the same 5 restaurants. And you come once, you're like, you look down the water each direction, you kind of go, okay, I've been to those restaurants, or those restaurants are available near me. This was a bit of a drive. I'm just going to go to the local one, and I've seen this. And we're hoping with the programming that we've been able to do with the client and their team that you do want to come back because there's always something different to do.
Well, just having things like that amphitheater is a way to keep bringing people back.
Yes.
When I saw that, I was like, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I
Yeah.
was like, oh, cool. There's nothing better than an outdoor concert.
Oh, it's the best.
But then having choice, you could literally make a day of it. Go to the spa, go do some shopping, go have some dinner, go to a show, and still see other things that you want to come back and do again.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that, in terms of the programming, that some of this is, pay to play. You're sitting at a restaurant, you're sitting at a bar, you're in a retail store, but a lot of it is free. It's available to anyone. It's public space. And that's also a unique commitment, that it's not just all privatized space. Some of it is thought of much more in a park-like way. And we already have locals coming and using the parts of the promenade that are open. It is a huge site. So it's already becoming an attractor for the local people in San Pedro. We just need to open the restaurants so that it gets out to everyone else.
Well, kudos to you and your team. I don't care what you're doing in life. You could get completely out of architecture and anything else. Getting 50 people on the same page is a challenge all in itself on anything that you do, because everybody has a different vision or a different thought process.
Oh, absolutely. I think, not to say to be like put myself on too much of a pedestal, but I'll put the office on a pedestal for a minute. I think that's sort of the superpower of Studio 111 is you want to hear all these competing voices, and then you're trying to find that common ground. So, that's why I intentionally use red and green as the analogies. You see two people who seemingly have nothing in common or no common ground in terms of what their goals are. And then you keep sort of pulling and pushing and prodding and challenging until you discover, actually, there's a lot of common goals here. And hey, here's a couple ways that we can do that. So not to go after my other architects because there's some extraordinary firms that I've worked for and that I know of. And a lot of those firms have a very rigid idea of what the project's going to be. And it's about manipulating your client to do that thing. And I think what's wonderful about Studio is, yes, we have goals as architects as well, but we're also, oh, that's an interesting idea that can plus up the idea, right? Even though it doesn't seem to make sense initially, is we want those ideas coming at us, whether it's from the community, whether it's from our client group, or it's a challenge from the city. How do we transform that within the idea so that it works? So everyone has a little bit of a voice. And, that's part of our larger goal as a company.
Well, I mean, that's a high level of emotional intelligence, which I have been kind of advocating for more of in our industry for a long time. It's at the end of the day, who's going to use this place, this building, this site?
Yep.
That's who you're trying to make happy. Not get an award or fulfill your own personal dream. And if you don't get outside of that vision and really start connecting and talking to people and getting that input, I don't think you ever get as good of a project at the end of the day as you do when you do get those people involved. So
no, absolutely.
I think
it's also the kinds of projects that we're working on. So like West Harbor is very much a public project. Now, if you're doing, a museum edition or something like that, that's much more you could be sort of more mono voice, I think. And that kind of helps, right? But that's not this project and the kind of projects that we're getting. We're getting much more where it's about lots of different kinds of users, from like small child playing in Central Plaza to, someone in their 70s going to see the Beach Boys, hopefully at, the amphitheater, right? You can't tell each of those people how to interact with your space. You've got to create a flexible space that allows that variety of people to feel comfortable and to want to be in that space. And it's a different kind of challenge, right, than making a strong sort of iconic building.
Are the Beach Boys still playing?
They were a couple of years ago. I know our the partner on the project, Nederlander, for the amphitheater were, I don't know if they were putting on the show with the Beach Boys, but I know they took Eric, one of the on the ownership team, down to see them in San Diego. So
I was just curious. I hadn't seen them around in a while.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what does the consultant team look like on a project like this? Did you or will you have to retain any out of the ordinary consultants? There's a lot going on here.
There is a lot going on here. I mean, there is all the usual suspects. So we have, amazing landscape architects, lighting designers, acousticians, things of that nature. The two most unique ones are really because it's just a unique site. So the first is the soils engineering, but the soils on this thing is just awful. It's just awful. So if you look at sort of where bedrock is, bedrock's diving very quickly off our site and it's all fill up above. So the soils engineer, how do we do this safely so these buildings last? We're assuming, sea level rise, that the site will flood at some point. So setting floor heights and things of that nature. And then some sort of a system that will allow this when something happens, let's say it floods and all the soil washes away, which is not an impossibility in the next 100 years. How do you make the building survive? So the soils engineer came up with this extraordinary system where what we have essentially is a 20 by 30 grid of piles. And these piles are anywhere from 80 feet to 100 feet deep.
Wow.
And that's across all the buildings. Now, hats off to the Matt construction team. They've worked really hard to get the cost on that down. Started off in the neighborhood of $150 a square foot just to get to the ground. So we have a slab to then put our buildings on. And they've got that down to like $60, $65 a square foot. So that's to their credit, is to work that hard to get that price down to it's a much more manageable number. So soils was insane. And the Leighton team did an amazing job dealing with an incredibly challenging site on that level. The other piece of this that's unique that leads from that, which we'll get into in more detail, is the pre-engineered metal buildings. So we've worked with two different companies on Phase 1A. We worked with a company called MWC, who coordinated with one of the, and I'm blanking right now on the name of the pre-manufactured building that they used, but they actually did the engineering, and then they went out to market and found someone to provide the pre-engineered metal buildings. So it's sort of like a Butler building, but not Butler. The current team we're working with on Phase 1B is all in-house. It wasn't about quality. It wasn't about the people. It was about the integration. So now we're working with a group called EcoSteel. They also do the same thing, but like I said, it's all in-house. So rather than using different consultants and trying to coordinate between all of these, we just go to the one-stop shop. They do all the steel for us, whether it's custom steel or for the pre-engineered metal building. So it's just a simpler one-stop shop.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about this site.
Yeah.
Okay, so I understand that this is a 42-acre site, which is ginormous. There were some challenges that you faced with this site. You've alluded to that a little bit. So tell me what you had to deal with in regards to this site and the existing buildings that were already there and your plan to deal with those challenges.
Yeah. So like I said, the primary challenge was the soils, and we've kind of talked about that. But in terms of the buildings, the port really took care of the demolition. So when we came on to, let's say, Phase 1A, which is just wrapping up and handing off the tenants next month, they cleared the site ahead of us. They did any required remediation. And then we came in behind them and did the buildings themselves. So that part of it was actually relatively straightforward and very painless for us. The one example, though, where them being just too far ahead of us on some that created a challenge was we do have these overwater decks. And I talked about Ports of Call earlier. Ports of Call had this sort of featured restaurant on one of the overwater decks, and it was the Ports of Call restaurant. And amazing two-story structure, big A-frame, very sort of Polynesian themed, lots of outdoor decking on the first floor, on the second floor. And this, it's a big concrete deck. You just look at it intuitively and you go, well, two-story building, much bigger than what we want to do. Yeah. And the client said, well, why don't you go ahead and clear that out so we will be ready to come in years later. So roughly 2018, they tear the building down. We come in 2020, 21, tenant wants to put an overwater structure. And it's a much smaller one. We're talking about maybe 300-400 square feet interior, about 1,000 square feet covered. It's essentially a trellis with a bar, right? What could be easier? What could be, it's low. It's not going to have a lot of weight. It's not throwing a lot of, forces on and movement side to side. So we thought, oh, this is going to be a cinch. Well, it turns out it's incredibly difficult because the port, and it's not the port's fault, it's no one's fault, but because that building came down before we were submitting drawings, as far as the city of LA is concerned, that building never existed. So now we're coming in and it's an empty site that we are proposing a building on. So suddenly they're like, well, prove that this can handle the building. And you're like, there's a 2-story building we tore down. And they're like, well, I have no record of that. You're like, see, you find the record of the demo. They're like, yeah, that was 4 years ago. If it was part of this submittal, you could grandfather in, but now you've got to go back and prove it. So that's become this real back and forth with the structural engineer, with the soils engineer. Remember those piles I mentioned earlier? Well, these don't have those deep of piles. So they're not going into the bedrock. They're going very deep, but not 80 feet. So it's become this negotiation. And that's one where we still don't have the answer. But that's one where, because those buildings came down earlier than we came on, it's created a real process. And also these overwater structures, no one really wants to take ownership of them. So you go to the city, we went to the city of LA initially, and they're like, It's over water. We don't handle buildings over water. Good luck. So like, I guess it's the port. So go to the port. They're like, no, that's a building. We don't deal with buildings. That's building safety. They were like, maybe the harbor. Harbor's like, no, we don't deal with it. That's the port. You're like, okay. We finally convinced the city of LA to review it. So we have a path, at least for permitting. Now it's just working through some of the tactical details of an overwater structure.
That cracks me up because I always joke that if you're doing a project in California, you really need to be ready to do a project in California.
Yeah.
I always equate it to working on Earth or working on Mars. And if you're in California, you're working on Mars. Just
Very.
because and that's not necessarily always a bad thing. It definitely, I think the process seems to take a lot longer on a lot of projects, but there's also a lot of really great things in place in California.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in Portland, Oregon. There's a whole lot of people around the country copying California to have better buildings and better standards and healthier buildings. Does it make it move really quickly though sometimes?
No, I've had not this project, but there's a project in my mind. Long Beach is well known as being very developer friendly and moving things forward. And it was a project everyone wanted to happen. It still took 4 years to get approved. So
yeah. I hear stories even from small architects about trying to get an ADU approved and it taking 18 months. And I'm like, what are you talking? That just is so foreign. Foreign to me.
Especially as you can literally use ADUs from the city that are pre-approved. So you think it would go quicker, but nothing goes fast.
And in Portland, you start twitching if anything's taking longer than 90 days.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's just so crazy to me. So outside of remediating the issues with the site, what kinds of site features and landscaping is being planned or has already been done to turn this site into a gorgeous promenade?
Yeah, well, we're really lucky. We do have this mile of waterfront, and the promenade is the second phase, and the final phase is under construction right now. That's literally right in front of what is our second phase, which is we're calling phase 1B. And like I mentioned earlier, part of it is already open in an area to the north of the site called North Park, and it's already incredibly successful. So Field Operations was the sort of the master plan landscape architect for the project, and they designed the promenade. And that part, it is this incredibly rich material palette that they were able to work with. So it's, let's say you're walking down the promenade and the water's on your left. Let's go sort of from left to right. So on the left, between you and the water, it's a bit of a drop. You're on a seawall. You're 5, 6, 8 feet high, depending on tide. They designed this really elegant stainless steel and Ipe guardrail system. So the top part that you touch is actually 1.5 inch thick Ipe. So it's robust. It's going to last. It meets all the sort of requirements of the port. So that's that side. Keeps you from falling in the water. Gives you somewhere to touch, watch, look out, watch boats come in and out. It's really beautiful. Then the surface you're walking on is about, I'm going to say 20 feet wide, and it's a collection of pavers, trees, Ipe benches, and a really beautiful concrete. So the pavers are by Textura, and they're sort of in a weave pattern. And then the concrete is actually something called lithocrete and was installed by Shaw & Sons, which in the LA area, and I'm sure other parts of the country, if you're doing concrete, you want it done best, your hope is you get Shaw & Sons. And lithocrete is, I don't know everything about the process, but from what I could learn, it's an intensive process to install correctly. So you need someone of Shaw & Sons quality to get it done. So they actually did the installation. And then finally, what's also part of the promenade and part of the landscaping is this sort of 7-foot buffer. And in that buffer is this really beautiful mix of I don't know if they're truly native plants, but they have that look and feel. I know they're low water and things of that nature. And it's sort of a meadow mix at the ground. And then there's a bunch of different featured types of plants. I just grabbed a couple to call out. There's fountain grasses, various kinds of sages, like 5 or 6, and Mexican milkweed. And they're done very naturally. So rather than a more rigid pattern that you might get in a formal setting, like when you do the site and you come from Harbor Boulevard and come in, that's a much more formal entry. There's a pattern of palms and different kinds of low plants. This one's much more natural and much more just more natural and informal. Sorry, that was the word I couldn't get out of my mind. But it does turn this, like, it's a really beautiful walk because of that mix of materiality. It's kind of a stately scale. And then it's just really smart. That sort of 7-foot path, part with all the planting is also where all the utilities go. So it collects your conduits, your sprinkler heads, things of that nature into that strip as well. So you can always access it without tearing up the entire promenade.
Oh, that's genius.
Yeah.
There are several different phases of this project planned. Hopefully you'll get to do all of them. Can you start with a broad description of the different phases and facilities, both what's been completed and what is being planned for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a big project. So there is a lot of different phases. There was a lots of discussion at one point of could we do phase 1A and 1B at the same time? Because while we were working with the client and helping them with the leasing, because we're not only the architects of record, we're also assisting with some of the leasing efforts. We're not doing the leasing, but we're providing a lot of different resources, renderings, things of that nature to help with it. And we were getting a lot of traction with the 1B tenants as well, almost at the same time, sort of like this one filled up to 70, this one filled up to 50%. But it just didn't make sense. The buildings were down from the port. We need to move San Pedro Fish Market. There's a lot of logistics. So we did phase 1A first, roughly 60,000 square feet, retail, dining. There's an experiential art, kind of like a Meow Wolf, going in on that first phase as well. So lots of different variety in that first phase, and a brewery. The brewery has its own outdoor space. So that'll be done by the brewer itself. At one point, that was a different phase and was actually part of ownership. It was going to be like a little park. So it became an extension of the brewery itself. Phase 1B, or the second phase of the project, is now under construction. So phase 1A is completed. They're just doing final punch list items. They'll get final sign up from the city, and then it actually gets handed off to tenants. So they'll start their build outs for the next 6 months to a year. Then phase 1B is in the foundations right now. So piles have been done. The grade beams are connecting the piles. They're running conduit, underground utilities, things of that nature to tie it all together. And that's about another 50,000 square feet. After that, there's a couple pieces that are sort of happening concurrently. Between those two phases is a small outdoor park space. When we started the project, it was actually called Container Kitchen. So it's meant to be almost like a Steelcraft or some of the other things that you see around the country, which are sort of food-based containers in a park setting. The containers sort of went away, and it's become much more of a retail and park-like space. So rather than thinking of it as, it's about dining and eating, it's about outdoor park space with your family, and it happens to have a bar. It happens to have a couple of small retailers. So rather than being primarily driven by retail, it's primarily driven by public space. And that's the next phase. We're actually working on the working drawings right now. SD went out on Friday. So yay.
Nice.
All the little things. Then at the same time that we're working on that, we're working on the amphitheater. So we're working on the amphitheater, and that also on Friday finished 100% SD. The last sort of big piece of this is what we're calling North Park. So North Park is a whole collection of different tenants. It's got some open space, and then it has different kinds of tenants. So the San Pedro Fish Market is putting together a temporary location in the park. They're working through that right now. They're in one temporary. They've going from contemporary to temporary to temporary. I was actually looking at their history. They did this in 1959 as well, where they had a couple temporary locations before they became where it's now phase 1B. So they're eventually going to live there for a few years in North Park. There's also lots of different tenants are in the mix that I don't know if they've signed, so I can't say them. Bark Social has signed, so they'll be there, and that's a sort of 25,000 square foot area. And then there's sort of an amusement area that's in discussion. Once again, what we're trying to create, and I think it's, once again, credit to Jericho and Rakovich for having the idea, is that we need different entertainment destinations as well. So you want to come to for lack of a better term, it's not this, but think of it more like a carnival kind of a space with rides and things. It is not that, but think of it like that in North Park, something like that there. So now you can bring your family, you come, you do that for a half a day. Maybe I'll hit a couple restaurants or take a walk. And then same thing with the amphitheater at the other side. So anchoring the two ends with some sort of an entertainment piece. And then the last piece really is Phase 1C. And Phase 1C will actually be a land lease, potentially, probably shouldn't say to who, but hopefully to a really great restaurant tenant who will build it themselves. They'll land lease to them, and then they'll build it. And that's sort of the whole big picture. The last piece that ties into our sustainability goals is the client is committed to sort of doing the parking lot with solar canopy. So, great shading for your tenants or your clients when they come. So I'm coming, I park. Hey, I'm under cover. When it's rain, that's super convenient. When it's hot, it's super convenient. And by the way, it's also powering the electric cars and helping power some of the buildings as well. So it's doing all the right things and making a much more sort of a better experience for people when they come.
So as a music lover, I was pretty excited to see this 6,500 seat outdoor amphitheater and festival lawn being planned. I want to hear more about that. And what are you building there? And what is this going to paint me a picture?
Okay. So it's incredibly simple. I mean, one of the things that's become a theme of the project is these sort of pre-manufactured pieces, both for cost and time, right? So they're on the amphitheater, it truly is more of a festival kind of a look and feel, but with an extraordinary site, right? No matter how amazing Coachella is in terms of the bands or whatever, you're in the middle of the desert. And yes, there's the mountains to look at, there's a beautiful sunset, but we're going to have this extraordinary harbor. And you're looking at the band, you're looking up the harbor at the bridge, San Pedro's in the background, the band is looking out at the water. It's extraordinary, once in a lifetime kind of a place for a show, right? And it's an outdoor theater. So, and we could take advantage of that fact that we have amazing weather, right? It's never that hot in the summer. It gets warm, but it's not like it's in the hundreds like Coachella. So it's a much more it's just much more even in terms of its temperature. So it's great all year round. Don't get a ton of rain. And so it's a very simple, flexible park-like space. So imagine a park first in your mind. So you come to a park space. And on the north side of that park space is a very much a festival style, almost a pre-manufactured stage, 6 feet up, 50 feet tall, made from a company called Eurotrust. So we're bringing it in from the Netherlands. They're going to ship it to us. We've had multiple meetings with them. Incredible company, really committed to growing in the U.S. market. And Nederlander found them and said, these guys are the best. I've talked to all the riggers. All the riggers love these guys. We need them on our project. So we're working with them. And then we're in that spirit of pre-manufactured pieces, the dressing rooms, all the back of house stuff is all shipping containers. So, we do a lot of projects with shipping containers, ironically, in the office. And of all the places we've ever used them, the place where all the containers come from feels like the place where you should be using containers somewhere in the project. So the ticket booth will be that. The dressing rooms will be that. There's a kitchen that's made out of a 40-foot shipping container. All that will be sort of the behind the scenes, very much a vibe for the artists. So that's on the north side of the project on the site. Then you've got the 6,200 seats on grade, and that's seated when they could have 6,200 people standing or seated. And then on the south edge of the project, kind of bookending the two sides to create this sort of outdoor room for the seating area, is a concession building. So that has not all the required restrooms, just because it would just be too much. And then the concessions, first aid, things of that nature. That's the one sort of stick-built building that we're building on the entire project. Everything else is some version of pre-engineered or something like that that's brought to the site. So simple one-story building, and then you go into sort of, where hey, I'm going to get a beer or hot dog or food or whatever I'm going to do on the other side of that, with pop-up vendors and things of that nature. So pop-up bars, things like that, portable toilets for on season, those will go away in the off season. So it's very much this sort of exercise in placemaking with minimal means, right? We don't have unlimited budget. We don't have unlimited time. We're trying to turn this around very quickly. We don't have the luxury, even if we had unlimited money, to like build a stage with all the restrooms indoors, right? If we were going to do that, it would add 6 months to a year to the process. We just don't have that luxury. So trying to capture all these sort of like tools at our disposal that we can bring on almost like an erector set to the site. So that's sort of the approach that we're using with the amphitheater.
It's funny. I interviewed an architect for the podcast some time ago that did an entertainment venue out in Austin, Texas, outside their soccer stadium, food, and there's a stage and things like that. And they did a funny thing with shipping containers. This whole venue is built out of shipping containers.
Okay.
But they stood some of them on end.
Yeah.
And put the bathrooms in them.
Oh, cool.
And I was, and they said it's really cool because you're sitting there looking way up to the top of the shipping container. And I just thought, wow, that's not anything I ever in a million years would have thought of. But it looks like it is, I don't know that it would work for an amphitheater this big. Right. This is, like a food area, people, coming and going from the games at the stadium. But I just thought that was the first time I'd ever heard of anybody standing a shipping container on end, like just for that single use kind of thing. So it was pretty cool. So I read, and I've been waiting to get to this question. I've been thinking, why didn't I put this question way up on this list? Okay. I read that you envision a collection of large, flexible, pre-engineered metal shed buildings on this site. We've been alluding to this throughout, leading up to this. So tell me about the reasoning for choosing this method. I know the answer because I did my homework. Tell me about your reasoning for choosing this method of construction on this site as opposed to stick-built construction.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the soils because we can't just build everywhere, right? So we have this sort of grid that we need to touch the grid points. So what the pre-engineered metal building does is with the fewest possible pieces, we enclose the most possible area. So, we have these on a grid of 20 feet and they can span up to almost 200 feet at a time. So our largest space is like 18,000 square feet with no columns. So completely flexible space inside. So if they want to carve that into, let's say, just generically a food hall, for example, that's easy, right? There's nothing in the way you're negotiating all these different sort of vertical supports, walls that are shear walls. All those pieces go away as issues, right? So as a retailer, building a retail space, you're building in that level of flexibility that you work really hard on stick building to accommodate. You want to give your client, you want to give your future tenants the opportunity to make lots of different changes. And this affords them that. So it was really that. The other reason was speed, right? We can get these things done. Once we've got approvals from the city, we're ordering the building while they're doing the foundation. So for example, with the EcoSteel team right now on phase 1B, and this is very similar to what happened with MWC and that team on phase 1A, the steel's already being produced. We haven't finished the foundation yet. There's probably another, I'm going to make a random guess, 3 more months of just prepping the site. In those 3 months, the steel should be ready. So as soon as the foundation's ready, steel pieces are coming, right? In fact, on 1A, we've, through a lot of reasons, not our fault or the owner's fault, just circumstances, we fell behind a little bit on construction after the steel had been ordered. So luckily, the owner had a building where we could store the steel, but the steel was ready and on site before the foundation was ready. And that's not normal, right? That your building is waiting for your foundation, right? Usually you finish the foundation, then you're ordering materials, you're waiting for that to come, you're scheduling the framing. It's like this thing was ready and pushing the foundation to get completed. So it's really that. It's giving us this incredible flexibility. It's touching the ground as few places as possible to help with the soils issue and creating just these extraordinary spaces. It also works thematically, right? Way back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the goals of the project from coming down from ownership was about being honest about where we are. If you go back to historical photos, they're sheds. They're simple shed buildings. They don't look like New England. They don't look like any particular place, right? They just look simple and honest. Like if you need to store lemons or fish or crates or build a sailboat, you want a big open space. So you're going to build a shed. It's just the simplest, most direct building. It's going to have a 3 to 12 pitch. You're going to shed water as quickly as it can, all that kind of stuff. And that's what these buildings are meant to evoke. So the fact that the soils demanded a certain approach and the conceptual basis of the whole project demanded a very similar approach suggested this idea that we should be using these pre-engineered metal buildings.
I would assume they look like they belong at the port.
They do.
As opposed to slapping a little village in the middle of a port.
100%. I mean, the little village was cute and it worked for a little bit and then people get tired of it. It's like bell-bottom jeans. They look amazing in 1973 and in 1974, everyone's like, I don't want to wear bell-bottom jeans anymore, right? So if you go too heavy in the theming, now I used to work in Imagineering. I get theming and it works in a fantasy place. But when it comes over into reality, then people get tired of it very quickly because it's not their daily experience, right? And we're certainly hoping that this isn't a theme, right? We're actually playing off a working port with direct, honest construction. That's different from it should look like a fishing village. It should look like a warehouse district. We're not trying to recreate a warehouse district. We're simply saying this is how people would have built at the turn of the century when it became a harbor. We're going to continue that tradition. And I think, at least my feeling is that when you tie into these actual traditions, local and otherwise, that will give your building more a longer play in terms of people accepting it as a real place.
Since these buildings are sitting on piles, right? Did the weight of the steel versus the weight of stick built come into play here? Was that a factor?
No, it really wasn't. I mean,
it wasn't?
Yeah, these are the requirements of the soil made this foundation so robust that we could have landed a high rise on these things, right? So ironically, the relative weight of the building is probably similar or maybe even a little less. And I'm totally making that up. I have no weight, no one's weighed a stick version of this, but we don't have all the layers and pieces that you would have on a stick build that to duplicate this much area. And we would have a lot more interior pieces that we don't have to have with this. So if you imagine just the amount of air we're enclosing without all these interior walls, and for our tenants, when they come in, it's not, we can't punch holes everywhere, but when a tenant comes, they go, we really want a door there. most of the time we can make a little bit of adjustment and we can accommodate that. Whereas if it was a stick-built building and it's a plywood shear wall, then you've got to do a lot more work. The foundations may not be right for that opening to occur or whatever. There's a lot of different challenges. But because we've got this sort of 20-foot grid of steel, as long as it's between the 20-footers and it's not one of the ones that has an X-brace going through it, it's relatively flexible, right? It's mostly a waterproofing issue at that point, not a structural.
So specific, I love to talk about lessons learned. So let's start with design. Um, what would you say so far has been the most challenging thing in the design to tackle, and how did you make it work?
Okay. Well, there's, as you alluded to, there's never ending challenges every day. And I'm not in those OAC meetings because they need an adult in the room that's much more capable than me. So we have Sarah Hooper, Marcus, and Ken, and Kuniko from our team in those meetings. So they handle all those problems. The one that I remember that was it was the best idea we had for the project and the hardest to pull off for the project was these mezzanines. And the problem with the mezzanine, once again, not MWC's fault. They were an amazing partner. They did an extraordinary job. But because of that process that was set up, when we had the idea for the mezzanines, that was a different engineer. And what it meant is that we built a mini building inside this larger building. And all of that steel couldn't touch the building enclosure, the piles that were for the building that was doing the enclosure, so it had its own foundation system, and it couldn't touch the storefront system that it was going through because that was tied in to the pre-engineered metal building. So you have to do everything is isolated from the larger building. So what we end up having is a totally different pile grid with a totally different column grid system, its own steel. When it gets to the storefront system, it's actually held off the storefront by 12 inches. Then 12 inches outside of the storefront, the system starts again. And there's a little piece that's an expansion joint, like a big expansion joint that allows a bunch of movement on each side that you can walk on top of and go outside. So problem number one, we can't touch the main building. We have to have this piece. Problem number two, we have to interact with that building somehow. Problem number three, we have to exit that piece, and we can't go inside or outside to do the exiting. So we end up with 4 sets of stairs, even though by size, we only need 2. So we have 2 on the outside, so you can get to both. Then we have 2 on the inside. And then we also need elevator access to this because of Americans with Disabilities Act. We need to provide equal and fair access, which obviously we're in favor of. But it's a unique challenge because what you would do, of course, is you would attach that to one or the other structure. Well, turns out we couldn't attach it to either of those structures because the mechanical room was on one part of the project, the tower was on the other part, and they had to be isolated from both the mezzanine and the main building. So it just became this like Gordian knot of challenge after challenge after challenge that we, once again, working with the MAT team, working with our structural engineer, working with ownership, we were able to solve all of them. And like I said, that phase is actually completed and being handed off. But it was this incredibly unique challenge. It's one of those ones where like my beard got grayer every week. Is you just learned another wrinkle of, oh, now we can't do this. You're like, oh, I thought we could do that. Yeah, we all did. Making those adjustments and being agile with the team, it was extraordinary to work through. But once it's done, that's an incredible learning moment as an architect, is all of these kinds of pieces. Now, having said that, that's part of why we're working with EcoSteel in the second phase, which ironically now has no mezzanines. But putting that aside for a minute, part of what we liked about the EcoSteel team and why we switched was they do all the engineering. So in the example of a mezzanine, all those complications would have gone away because they're all the same team. So they would have just adjusted their steel engineering to accommodate the mezzanine. So we wouldn't have needed the expansion joints. It could have all worked as one unit. So once again, just 2 different two different pipelines that were set up by the two different companies. So once again, not that MWC didn't do an amazing job, but they have a different pipeline than EcoSteel does. EcoSteel is really not a pre-engineered metal building company. They're a steel company that happens to do pre-engineered metal buildings, but they integrate all these other steel pieces very easily at the same time.
So I have to ask,
Yeah,
as I don't, if you said it, I missed it. Where'd you put the elevators?
they're right in the building, but they have an expansion joint. They don't touch the building at the top, so they're freestanding, and they don't touch the mezzanine. So there's a small expansion there as well. No one will know
Interesting.
it. Only we know it as the architect and the structural engineer and the contractor. We know the sort of challenges of making it work, but as an experience, no one will ever know that it's a separate structure.
Interesting. Now I really want to see it. Tell me a little bit more about some of the unique materials that you've used on this project or that you plan to use on this project.
Yeah, so funnily enough, in terms of architecture, it's incredibly straightforward materials. The material palette that I talked about on the promenade, that's where we're really getting to do something in terms of material using epay, different kinds of pavers, things of that nature, and we've kind of talked about those already. On the architecture, these are very, as I said, simple, direct, honest shed buildings, and so they're pre-engineered metal steel. So we got steel. We've got aluminum storefront systems, insulated glazing, things of that nature. But we do have to protect all of this steel and to protect all of this, single skin metal buildings, the metal skin as it is. So we've done a couple things on the coil that made the panels. We actually specified something from Sherwin-Williams, a coastal coating. It's a fluorethane coating, and actually in the coil they do this sort of protection on it that's above and beyond their normal primer, and it's rated for coastal communities, that kind of thing. So it will handle the salt air, all those kind of things. Basically, you put a piece of steel out on that site and give it 5 years, and it's gone. It's either been eaten away completely or it's just pitted and rusted. And we didn't want that to happen to the building. So we provided that. So now the single skin is protected. And then there's a high performance coating called macroepoxy. And that is what they use at, say, SoFi Stadium for their steel. And all that is done in the factory by the pre-engineered metal building company. So when they coat it with color, they're using a special kind of a paint that's a high performance paint. And then any sort of touch up that needs to happen on site can happen as well. So, as opposed to some other specialty finishes that require special inspection or any of that kind of stuff, we can actually do touch up on site. And once again, shout out to Sarah Hooper on our team, who became an expert in all these different coatings over months. Remember, these amazing Excel spreadsheets she came up with, like, here's the 17 different products, and here's the people I talked to, the cost, the turnaround times, all the stuff you deal with, Cherise. Sarah, who's our project manager on the project and project architect, she just became an expert. She dug in and she owned it, and credit to her. She found the best product at the best price with the best turnaround times that was available. And that was the macroepoxy and the Sherwin-Williams.
Well, I have to say that truly, I think they get the short end of the stick a lot of the time, but my best resource as a spec writer are the manufacturer's reps.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly the technical manufacturer's reps. They make my job so much easier. I can't be an expert on every product. I have some great friends at Sherwin-Williams, but they are truly it's another thing I often mentor younger professionals about. Pick up the phone and call them. They will cut your time by 90% and help you get exactly what you need, where you need it. And the good ones will give you the pros and cons, and they'll say, hey, you shouldn't use me on this job. You should use somebody else. So yeah, I love to hear that. I'm sure some of my buddies at Sherwin-Williams are going to be doing a little happy dance when they hear this episode.
I want to second that. Like anytime I work with a rep and they're honest, like, hey, I'm not the best product for this. You should talk to so and so. They're immediately like, I'm looking for another opportunity to work with that person because that sort of honesty and what a business that can be very cutthroat to have another rep's back and like just be honest. Like, hey, there's a better product than for what you particularly need. Um, is amazing. I mean, I had that happen to me on a project in Canada where we really wanted to use this one particular storefront. And we brought in the guy that this firm had a 40-year history with. And he's like, oh, you're in Canada? Just call Conair. They own Canada. And it was like, oh, okay. And he put us in contact with the right person at Conair. This guy was incredibly helpful and gracious, but it wouldn't have happened without this other person just being open about like, no, it's better for you if you do it this way.
I actually do a presentation for manufacturers, reps, and design professionals working better together, what both
Yeah.
sides could be doing better than how we typically do it now. And that's exactly what I tell. If I tell the reps, if I come to you and you tell me, no, you don't want me this time, which is
Yeah,
to their benefit as well. They don't want their product to fail.
of course.
I will never forget you because you gave it to me straight. And my next project, when I've got a different situation going on, you're probably going to be one of the first people I call
Oh, for sure.
because, yeah, there's a trust there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit already. One
Mhm.
phase is done, another one is currently under construction. Construction always comes with the need for flexibility and daily problem solving, which I'm sure your team is that's on the ground is seeing regularly. Can you tell
Yeah.
me about one notable challenge your team has faced during construction and how you solved it?
Yeah. So it goes back to the soils. So this is a challenging um, slab system. So what we've tried to do is with tenants who are in early enough is the owner has been really committed to making this as painless as possible for the tenants. So it's not impossible, obviously, to put it in later on. There's just extra work to do it. Like it's not just cutting a normal retail slab. So whenever we can, we try to coordinate those underground needs, anything that needs to go under slab, as early as possible. So we're really able to work with the tenant. And if they can get us that information, we go back to the city, we do an SK, we pull a supplemental if needed, work with a local inspector, we get that underground installed. So for example, right now there's, I think a tenant I'm allowed to say because they're on the website, Yamashiro, an extraordinary Japanese restaurant. And the middle building on the phase 1B is them. And all their underground stuff's going in. So beer lines, water lines, gas, whatever they wanted underground, that's all being done right now. You can see it in the aerial photos. It's insane. Like that level of commitment from an ownership team is unprecedented in my experience. The other thing we'll do as an architect is when we get that stuff from the tenant, once again, is we will work through moving doors, windows, things like that. Anything that we can accommodate before, say, curbs are poured, for example, then it becomes really hard to move a door. But hey, curbs haven't been poured yet, and we haven't finalized that, looking that final drawing for them to approve all those, we can move them right now. It's just a dimension on a piece of paper. So as long as we can have that level of flexibility, we'll provide. But in terms of a challenge, it's the day-to-day is really accommodating future needs and working within that slab system.
Well, because really, it's not just your client.
Yep.
Every individual company or person that's leasing a space has different needs.
Yep.
So you have a whole bunch of clients, really.
Yeah.
I can just see what that CA process must look like.
It's really challenging. Well, there's a weekly OAC for both phases. They're on different days to handle it with slightly different teams to make sure everyone's on top.
Better you than me. Were there any unique sustainable design efforts? We talked about the solar panels over the parking. Any other unique sustainable design efforts on this project that you'd like to highlight?
I don't know that it's anything particularly unique. I mean, this goes back to your earlier discussion, like about Mars and Earth. We're on Mars. So a lot of the stuff that would be exceptional in other jurisdictions are required, right? So just to meet green building standards, we're going to be LEED silver, which is amazing. So like, and we're doing it as a campus. So it's not just one building. The whole campus is going to meet LEED silver. The only sort of like semi-exceptional thing is we're using recycled steel. And we're building in, this isn't directly sustainable, but it leads to more sustainability is, there's a lot less building waste because we're using so many pre-engineered pieces. So, you're not bringing out a bunch of steel, then cutting pieces of steel, then bolting it together. And, that dimension was off a little bit. So you save a little bit more. There's a bunch of waste. That level of waste is not happening at least on site, right? And I'd like to think that the pre-engineered metal steel team could be a little more efficient because those dimensions are set in a factory setting rather than on site. So the hope here is that the level of waste is much less, right? So we're building in some sustainability on that as well. And then you brought back the idea of the photovoltaics. The hope here is that might even increase us to LEED gold. Probably won't, but it might. And even if it doesn't, there is this sort of commitment to anything we can do passively. Can we open the building up and passively cool some of it if the kitchen's enclosed? It meets health department requirements. We're bringing a lot of people outdoors. So there'll be some small heaters and things like that in inclement weather. But otherwise, we're trying to rely on daylighting as much as possible. We're trying to rely on passive cooling as much as possible. We're trying to bring in the PV so we're passively getting as much passive energy as possible. And then, like I said, the recycled steel content as well. So there are some pieces, but we're not reinventing, for example, sustainability. So we're not suddenly completely off grid or something of that nature.
Well, considering that we have listeners in 198 different countries,
Yeah.
I wanted you to tell me about that anyway, because there are a lot of people working in a lot of places that don't even know what you do over there on Mars.
Right.
And are not aware of some of these options just to make healthier, better buildings. Because I would think for sustainability, since this is on the water,
mm-hmm.
In hot weather, you have to get some breeze off that water.
Yeah.
And so that would aid in that passive cooling. You're always, I mean, I know it's not like open ocean in a port, or I don't know what this port looks like.
It's literally where you've just come off the open ocean into the port. Like we're right at that sort of threshold between the two. So you get an amazing breeze all times of year. It's always got that soft breeze. Sometimes it's a little more intense, but passive cooling is a cinch. People seated outside they're going to be comfortable year round. There are gaps between the buildings where we're going to be, naturally increasing. So even if it's not that windy on a particular day, those areas are going to be windy where we can open up a building and exhaust heat passively. So we're not relying on those, but they're all sort of built in.
So what are you most proud of on this project?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, in terms of the project itself, I think the fact that this very much is of San Pedro. Like there was a moment when the project had a different name and it would very much evoke Seattle. And people in San Pedro are like, no, we're not Seattle. We're different. We're unique. We're special. And the fact that ownership embraced that and that we were allowed to keep pushing that idea of making it more and more local, whether it's the placemaking pieces, whether it's the tenants, the form of the buildings, the materiality of the buildings, I think that's really important. The other piece of this is like it is providing access to a mile of waterfront. And we talked about that at the beginning of this is, California has a deep commitment to public access to the water and making rather than just a place where like you park, like a lot of the vision of that is in California is a big parking lot, and then you walk to the water's edge, and there's nothing there. It's a hot dog stand, maybe a bathroom building that's closed, and you're like, okay, I guess this is public, but there's nothing there, and there's no reason to come back. This is very much a similar level of access, but with a bunch of different things to do. A reason to stay for all day, rather than like get there and after an hour you're like, okay, there's not a lot to do, there's not a lot to eat, I'm going to go home. Right? We've done plenty of that with my kids over the years, and this is not that at all. So I think that is something really to be proud of. I think on a personal and sort of inter-office professional level is we've used this project to give a lot of younger than me, because I'm becoming the older guy in the office, staff members a chance to really grow in their position, right? So we've had a woman named Allie who's no longer with the firm, but she started right out of school with us on this project, did 2 years of like really growing into running parts of the project to the point where the client wouldn't even call me, they would call Allie directly, right? So from the first day on the project where she didn't know what a leasing plan was to running the leasing plan effort, right? I'm really proud that we were able to, I mean, she was an amazing person, so she was going to do that no matter what, but to have a small part in helping her with that was incredibly important. And then Sarah Hooper, I'd like to once again call her out as the PM. She's really grown into that role of running this whole project on this project, right? So now she's running these meetings with confidence. She's tackling a lot of different things, and this project keeps growing every year, and she keeps taking on more and more responsibility and manage those incredibly well, right? To the point where the client's like, oh no, if I could steal her from you, I'd steal her from you. And I'm like, please don't. He's like, I would never do that. But that once again, I think that's something for the office to be really proud of, that we've given, a lot of times in architecture, it's so much is at stake on every project that you just give me my best person. Like, I'm not training anyone. I don't need someone learning on my project on my dime. I need this done perfectly day one and go. It's like the difference between jazz and rock and roll. In jazz, when you go to a solo, you can kind of find where you're going to go and then discover the piece. If it takes 10 minutes, it takes 10 minutes. On rock and roll, you have to burn from the first note, right? It's got to be perfect. Note one, because you've got 35 seconds to say everything you want to say. And that happens in architecture as well. And in both of these examples, and there are others on the team, we didn't do that, right? We gave these people who we knew could handle it, we knew would grow into these roles, and now are exceeding our expectations for what they do. So it's a little bit of both.
You have no idea where I could do a whole episode just talking about what you just said. So thank you for sharing that, because when I'm teaching, one of the things I tell my students, I have some phrases that make Cherise's head spin around on her neck. And one of them is, I don't have time.
Right.
On anything in this business. You do not have the amount of time it's going to take you to deal with it later because you couldn't find the time right now.
Yeah.
It gets exponentially worse the further you wait. And whether that's training staff or dealing with a design decision, another one is, I'll deal with that during construction. Oh, that one really gets me going. Yeah. So, preaching to the choir.
Hardest and most expensive.
Exactly. And I do think anybody, especially I know as much as I mentor, you learn better by doing.
Yeah.
Than some talking head in front of the room, and then being given the opportunity to do.
Yeah.
And to try it and have some support when you fail, because you should be failing up in this process. You're going to fail. Sure. I've been doing this a long time and I fail all the time. Yeah. That's just the nature of this business. Tell me about one lesson learned from this project that will make you a better architect on the next project.
Well, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but just we've become experts in pre-engineered metal buildings. Like we've probably we've used those on multiple other ones, and we've branched out into other kinds of pre-engineered pieces. So I can, that was not on my bingo card of architect when I started at Studio 111, that I would suddenly know a lot about shipping containers or pre-engineered metal buildings or Quonset huts or any of those kinds of pre-engineered pieces. So it's become a real part of our, it's another arrow in our quiver, right? That we can pull from on an as needed basis. And the coordination of all those pieces, because once you bring that in, you're coordinating that with, you're not drawing all those pieces, you're giving design intent to those teams, but then you've got to really dig through and work with that team and make sure you're explaining what your intent is really well so that they understand it. And it comes back, because you lose some level of control, right? You have to be willing to give up a little bit to get a lot back. So I think that as well, and that part of that sort of as a life lesson as a professional has led into other pieces that, being a better communicator, being much more direct, making better decisions quicker, because that's the other thing. You don't have the luxury when you work with, say, a shipping container or some of those pre-engineered pieces. Those are way out ahead of you. Like, that guy is ready to go. You draw a napkin sketch, and this is always I love working with these guys, but you have a basic rendering and they come back with a full Revit model and they've got their standard details in it. And it's a week and a half later and you're like, dude, I'm not ready for that, man. I'm still moving doors. They're like, what? It's like that difference of speed of execution between us imagining our way into what the building will be and them we're just executing the building. You drew it, it's 100 feet by 120. Well, it's not anymore, it's 90. Oh, well, I wish I'd known. Well, I wish you hadn't drawn everything already. So setting those expectations, but now we know. So now we know when to withhold information or when to convey or what questions to ask. And we didn't know that 2 years ago.
Before we get to our two closing questions.
Yeah.
Give me a sneak peek. I mean, obviously this project's going on for a while, but give me a sneak peek at what I can expect to see from Studio 111 in the future. What else are you working on?
Well, we're working on a ton of stuff, actually. A lot of housing projects, affordable housing. There's a potential high rise in a location I can't talk about. We don't have an official NDA, but I've done enough NDAs at my imaginary time to get the sense that this probably one's under an NDA. But I wanted to highlight two right now. So one is a $1 billion project in downtown Los Angeles that Alan Pullman, one of our partners, is in charge of. And that's going through entitlements right now, but it's a huge project on Alameda and 4th. And it's, 8 different buildings, thousands of units of residential. There's office, there's a hotel component. There's a featured tower by David Adjaye Architects out of London and Africa, an extraordinary contemporary architect, future Pritzker Prize winner for sure. It's just when he gets it, not if. And to work with that caliber of people, Continuum is the client, the extraordinary client. It's just an amazing, important project for the office. So this sort of $1 billion project. On the other hand, very local project, 400 Ocean Gate, that's our other partner, Michael Bond, is working on. And it's an adaptive reuse. One of the things that we've become specialists, in these sort of pre-engineered pieces, but we've also become specialists in converting office buildings that are no longer needed to be office because of work from home. Here I am. That demand that was there is just not as high a demand. Converting them into housing, which the city, the state needs as much as we can give them. And that's what 400 Ocean Gate is. It's taking a defunct office tower, adding some housing in addition on top of the parking garage, and then converting the office tower itself into high-rise living. And at different price points as well, which I think is something we always look to, rather than just all one type of housing within a housing project. Michael and Alan have really advocated for this mix of people. So different age groups, different income levels. And that's the 400 Ocean Gate project. And there's like 10 more projects that we're working on I could talk to, but those are the two I thought would be a nice balance between the two. Sort of very large $1 billion development that we're really master planning. We'll probably do 1 or 2 buildings of the 8. And then this Ocean Gate, much more local, much smaller scale.
That was a loaded question, so I know what to target you for later. So
Okay.
you can come back and tell me about another project. So we always close with 2 questions, one being a more broad industry question, and then our final question that I force everybody to answer whether they want to or not.
Yeah.
So the broad industry question. You and I share a commonality in that we both teach outside of our day job. We talked about that at the beginning. I'm a big fan of sharing knowledge and mentorship and helping others grow, whether they're my level or coming up behind me. Where do you think we could improve in that arena to better prepare our student design professionals for what they're going to see in the real world when they get out and actually join a firm? Because I see plenty that learned a whole lot about design and they walk in and they're going, what is it you're doing?
Yeah.
What do you think we could, you're an architect, you went to school. What could the schools change to make those young people better prepared for real project delivery?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I teach now again at Cal Poly. So I used to teach everywhere in Los Angeles. I taught at Art Center, SciArc, USC for a little while, Art Center, O's College, Cal Poly, Walt Disney Imagineering. I used to teach there as well. But Cal Poly has very much embraced this idea that they're a polytechnic. It's in the name, and we should probably teach it that way. So not that we can't improve as a school, but I think the school is trying to address exactly that issue. So in 3rd year, which is the year I teach now, we're very much transitioning them introducing them into professional issues that they'll deal with in an office environment, whether it's the different kinds of pathways for careers, that not everyone's going to be a designer, right? I mean, it worked out for me. I know people it didn't work out for, but I very much figured out early on in my career, I do not have the head for management. I'm terrible with math. And, in terms of money and contracts, I'm not good at those kinds of things, but I'm a decent designer. So I could do that. So I'm going to focus on design. And it worked out. I'm a design director and very proud to have become that. But that's not the only pathway, right? Some people, I have a friend who the very first person I met on the very first day of architectural school, I was sitting there, he walked in, we introduced ourselves, and he's been a friend ever since. And he did the exact opposite. He's like, I don't want to design. I want to manage teams. Like, he discovered that was what gave him pleasure, was managing the team, getting people the right resources, negotiating the contract, have enough time or whatever to protect the design, protect the intent, protect the firm. That's what got him excited about being in the industry. And I'm like, I don't know how your brain works. I love you. That's exactly what we need. We need that. And then other people have this passion for technical and getting things built. We have people in their office, like, they don't want to design. They don't want to manage. They want to be there. They want to work with the contractor. They want to argue about, like, the bolt sizing and that. And no, that should align with that. The kind of things that I'm like, yeah, I great. I missed all of that. I'm glad you saw it, kind of thing, right? So we talk about that within the school. And then we insist in 3rd year that you're dealing with structures. You're learning how to read the code. You're learning all those sort of much more practical things that I know I never got in school when I was a student in the late 80s. You just didn't do that. You were going to be Zaha Hadid or Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's like, no, none of us are going to be that. Like, 1 out of every 10,000 of us will get to have that opportunity. And the rest of us are, fighting to get a mezzanine built out of steel inside a pre-engineered metal building, have the two not kill each other, right? That's what most of us are going to do. And you need to be ready for that. So I think that's to Cal Poly's credit, is they are trying to do that. They're trying to make that shock of going into the industry much less, right? Like, I didn't learn how to read the code till I was well into my career, right? And these kids are already learning it in third year.
Do me a favor, would you?
Yeah.
Will you show your students a specification and
We
explain to them that that's only their drawings are only half the documents?
and that actually the specifications take precedent over the drawings.
They
The
don't.
drawings.
You're wrong.
Oh, I'm wrong. Good.
You're wrong. AIA A201, the drawings and specs are complementary because they each carry two different sets of information.
Thank you.
Cornerstone rule is say it once and say it in the right place. So you can't build the building without both pieces.
This is true.
It's physically impossible. See, I got to teach you something today.
There you go.
And that's what I teach is project delivery.
Got it.
All the roles and responsibilities and contracts in your specifications and the relationship to the general conditions and the drawings and appropriate CA procedures.
Got it.
And it's like, I'm begging. If I was queen of the world, you would not get out of college without that base knowledge.
Sure.
And so I have a teacher in front of me. I'm going to inject a little bit and say,
I love it.
They need more still, but
no, for sure. And I think the the professional practice class has gotten much better. When I took it, it was really just and you will be sued, da da da, and you will be sued, da da da, and you will be sued. I'm like, okay, I'm 19, like this is ridiculous. And now it's much more, let's run a firm, and you kind of mock up a firm, you learn how to put a business plan together. It's much more truly professional practice, getting you ready for that, rather than just trying to frighten you into having the best, insurance you could afford as a professional.
Well, and I see that value, but most of these young people coming out of school are quite a few years away from running a firm.
Yeah.
But they will. I've had young people walk up to me and say, my PM just told me I had to mark up the specs, and I've never seen one before. They don't even understand the weight that their documents carry and that they're part of the contract.
Yeah.
And who can do what. Like, you can't tell the contractor how to do their job. And those are the pieces. We do it every single day, everybody on the team. And I've worked in 4 disciplines. Mm-hmm. Nobody's getting this in school. And so it's like, how? No, I call it the cycle of abuse. Now I know why everybody does it wrong, because their boss did it wrong and their boss did it wrong. And they just keep passing it on and taking it like the complimentary. I can't even tell you how many times I've had that conversation over the years about the documents, what specs taking precedence over the drawings.
Right.
Not a thing. And it doesn't carry, even if you have a precedent statement, it doesn't carry any weight in a court of law. But it's just, I would love to see more of that. And I saw that you teach, and I'm like, he's going to tell me what they're doing, what we need to do better, so these young people can just be more successful out of the gate.
Yeah. And the other thing that they do, and a lot of schools have started this, and it's not to put the onus on the profession, but there is a certain number of hours they have to intern, and they have to intern at different types. And part of that internship is geared around the way you get your licensure, meaning you're supposed to get experience in contracts, those kind of things. So you can't just, the idea is to not just, like when I was an intern, it was like build the model. You just sat in the back, you built models all summer. It's like, well, that's what I do at school. They're like, yeah, that's what you bring value to do. So just do that. So in theory, if it's a really robust internship program, they're in a client meeting. They're hearing that. They're in an OAC meeting, so they hear some of the problems. They're sitting down with a PM when they're redlining a set, so they learn what redlining a set means. They might be in the kickoff with the spec writer, because we have a spec writer office as well, where you're having that discussion, you're reviewing specifications, so you're seeing some of that. That doesn't happen all the time if it's a small firm, for example, but the larger firms that the students are doing their internships, they're getting much more of that sort of exposure and experience.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Because, we need this new generation of architects to come show us all how it's done.
Yeah, and not all just quit and go into the gaming industry.
Exactly. Final question. Everybody gets this question.
Mhm.
Easiest question of the day. That was total sarcasm, by the way.
Yes.
We all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. Personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
Well, it's a funny thing because this was not my goal initially. It's grown into my goal as I've gotten older. Like when I was in my 30s, there's a great John Cage quote called "Don't try to change the world; you only make things worse." It was actually something his mother said to him, and that was always sort of my mantra. It's like, well, yeah, things will kind of take care of themselves, and if I touch it, I'll probably break it. But then what I realized was without consciously making it a goal, I was doing it anyway. I was making an impact on people. And as much as I like to think of, like, I have a friend who is like, his quote was, "I like to think of my life as a cautionary tale." And I was like, watch what I do, but don't do what I'm doing. You should, do the other thing. Basically, like, learn from my mistakes. But I had a student, I'm old enough now that I had students who are now principals in firms, and and more than one. So I always joke with my students, like, no, you can be successful and take my class. Don't worry, you'll be okay. And I never really thought of it as me making an impact until I was at an event and he came up and he goes, "Oh my God, I've wanted to talk to you for a while. I wanted to thank you because," and I don't know if he was just being nice or what, but he's like, "I'm here because of your class. Like, your class inspired me to do what I'm doing." Like, he dove deeper into design, or it was the one chance for him to really explore who he was as an architect and take chances. And, my classes are when not right now, third year is very much about success and all that kind of stuff. When I teach my design studio the way I would teach a design studio, it's about failure and giving the students permission to fail. I want all of us to be confused and angry and crying, not literally, but, Daniel Libeskind used to call it the midnight of the soul, where you don't know what to do. You don't know why you're doing it. You don't know how to get there, but you get there eventually. And eventually with my classes, everyone gets there, but they don't know how. And I don't know how, right? And that's what's fascinating about it. And I like to think that that's the lesson he got from the class, was that, no, I don't know where I'm going to go or how, but I'm going to get somewhere amazing. And I need to just put myself in those situations. So if I can, I guess that's kind of what I've done as an instructor in that part of my professional life. And I think to some extent as a professional, I've done that as well, that I give as a design director, I'm kind of like backstopping behind design people underneath me, whereas senior designer, junior designer, design manager we have at the firm is like, they know that they can feel comfortable coming to me if they don't know what to do, or they did something and it didn't work. That I'm not the design director with the black cape who's like, "You screwed up my sketch." I'm the guy who's like, "Okay, that didn't work. What else can we try? Like, let's work together and come up with a new idea." Or the client said they hated it. "Okay, let's go. Let's do it again. Let's come up with something even better." I'm taking that kind of approach. I'm hoping will do for the people who work with me and my future students what it did for that student who's now, design director of the firm. He's design principal of the firm. It's, a 500-person firm. He's running hundreds of millions of dollars a month out of that office, and he's in charge. And somehow what I do as a person helped him do that. And that, like I said, wasn't my goal, but it happened. So it's kind of funny that I kind of fell into that goal.
It's funny because I've heard similar things from some of my students, sometimes years later, because I've been teaching the course that I teach. I've been teaching for about 12 years now. And I'll get this email like 6 years later or 8 years later. "Cherise, I don't know if you probably don't remember me, but I took your class and here's what happened afterwards." And it's always makes my day, makes my week. when I get those messages. But the thing is for every one student you don't hear anything from,
Mm-hmm.
there are countless others that are doing something differently
Right.
and making a difference in their world. Those ripples are going so much further than you'll ever know.
Yeah.
And I like to think of it that way. I don't get to hear about it most of the time, and it's a day maker when I do, but I know that I've made a difference. I know that I've taken time out of my busy life to share
Yeah.
what I have to offer. And that's helped people. I've had students say, your voice was in my ear, Cherise. Your voice was in my ear in this situation. And I'm like, yes,
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
put my crown on. But it's a noble cause. I knew from our emails we were going to be friends.
For sure.
Very much kindred spirits. Scott, I can't thank you enough. This has been a absolutely fantastic interview.
Oh, thank you.
It's an incredible project. I am definitely, well, who's going to say no to Long Beach anyway? But I am definitely going to come check this out. I'm going to wait a little bit longer, have more of it up and running, and
Yeah.
come check it out. I'll go to a concert. That's what I want to do. I want to go to a concert there and check it.
Oh no,
go hang
for
out.
sure. We're all waiting for the opening night of the first show.
Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. It was really, really thoughtful.